a high school teacher in New York, once admired for his calm intellect and quiet dedication, vanished without a trace after pulling off the unthinkable. He didn't just steal from the mob, he outsmarted them, taking $3 million and leaving behind only whispers, fragments of rumor, and a trail of fear that stretched across the city. Some say he fled overseas, others claim the mob buried him in a concrete grave, but the truth is darker, stranger, and far more human than anyone imagines. This is not just a story of theft, but of obsession, betrayal, and the fragile line between morality and survival. It's about a man who thought he could bend fate itself, and the price he paid when the shadows closed in. Stay with me through this tale of deception, love, violence, and bitter irony, and make sure to subscribe, because this is only the beginning. On paper he looked like the safest man in the borough, the kind of teacher parents pointed to when they tried to convince their teenagers that ordinary goodness still paid off. He was in his early 40s, tall enough to be noticed but quiet enough to be forgotten, a man with the kind of face that hinted at patience learned the slow way. He taught AP statistics and remedial algebra at a public high school wedged between a funeral home and a bodega with a permanent layer of ash on the awning. He graded exams on the train, ate his dinner standing up over the sink, and went to bed listening to the radiator mutter like a tired priest. People mistook caution for virtue and called him moral. In truth, he was something colder, disciplined. Discipline could be worn like a halo in daylight and like a blade after dark. He had learned both ways. He kept an index of tiny rituals that gave him a sense of belonging to a structure larger than impulse. Coffee only when the first bell rang. One subway car earlier than necessary to account for delays. A tie he refused to iron, preferring the humble crease that said he had more important things to manage than fabric. Students believed he was a fair grader. Colleagues believed he was a good listener. The principal believed he would never ask for more money because people who don't complain are often mistaken for people who don't need. None of them knew that his bank app showed a monthly wobble between solvency and the kind of overdraft fees that feel like being fined for breathing. None of them knew he counted not just numbers, but hours spent pretending that the life he had was the life he deserved. He had been married once and divorced quietly, in the way a shopkeeper removes a sign from the window and leaves a faint sun-bleached rectangle where it used to be. He stored that rectangle in the back of his mind with a few other things that still carried a charge. A father who had worked construction until his shoulder broke down like a rusty hinge, a mother whose medicine cabinet hummed like a beehive, a dissertation in applied probability that never became a degree because he chose a paycheck over a future. He pretended to feel no bitterness about the choices he had made, but bitterness does not require acknowledgement to do its work. It calcifies in the little gaps behind your ribs, then one day you discover you have been armoring yourself against people who never tried to hurt you. The hinge of his fate was a boy named Rocco whose transcript was a museum of near misses. Rocco was the kind of student who mastered charm the way other students mastered musical scales. His jokes made the classroom breathe. His attention wandered like a dog off the leash. On paper, he did not belong in AP anything, but the guidance office believed in redemption narratives during September and exhaustion narratives by March. The boy arrived with a smile that asked the room's permission to keep being forgiven. The teacher saw something else, a familiar hunger for a shortcut masked as good humor. He recognized it because he had trained himself to walk past that hunger every day of his adult life. When the first parent-teacher night of the year arrived, Rocco's family came not as a pair of worried adults, but as a vague entourage that smelled of expensive cologne and cold metal. The man who did most of the talking insisted he was an uncle. His hands were the size of unwise decisions. He said the boy needed someone who could explain numbers in a way that made them behave, as if numbers were a room full of feral dogs and the teacher carried the only whistle. The teacher heard the polite threat beneath the politeness. The future has already been chosen for the boy. Your job is to make the path toward it look dignified. The teacher agreed to after-school sessions because refusing would cause more trouble than accepting, and because a few extra bills tucked into a textbook never offended anyone who knew the price of grocery lists. He told himself he was still on the right side of a line. Lines are funny that way. They seem to hold until the wind changes. The sessions began in an empty classroom that always smelled faintly of stale pencil shavings and winter jackets. Rocco pretended to dislike math but loved the thrill of watching uncertainty narrow into a single correct answer, the way a crowd compresses to let an ambulance through. The teacher saw a chance to repair one boy's life and, against his better instincts, to be appreciated by men who had built their lives on very different math. At the edge of these meetings stood the uncle, who wore a smile that never changed shape. He asked polite questions about variance, and risked the way a man asks about the structural integrity of a bridge before driving a truck across it. He referred to his work as contracting. The teacher understood that contracting can cover many trades, including the trade of buying briefcases no one inspects. A school is a sanctified place only if you are naive enough to believe sanctity repels blood. The city outside knew better. The city taught through repetition that everything noble has a back door, and if you stand there long enough someone will come out for a smoke and invite you inside for a minute. That minute becomes an hour, then a winter, then the rest of your life. The invitations arrived slowly. A casual mention that the uncle's outfit managed numbers for small games among friends. A joke about March Madness getting out of hand in neighborhoods where people treated basketball brackets like religion. A light request, almost embarrassed, that maybe the teacher could suggest a way to balance a ledger that always seemed to tilt one way when a certain team covered the spread. He told himself he was just explaining the law of large numbers to a man who had confused luck with entitlement. He was just tidying the world a little. If someone used that tidy world for cash, that was not his fault. He thought morality could be measured like homework, with partial credit for good intentions. He accepted an envelope once and did not count the bills because counting would make it real. He placed the envelope in his freezer behind a bag of peas and an ice tray that never froze all the way through. He told himself he would return it when the boy's grades stabilized, as if returning money could rewind time. The deeper truth arrived on a Sunday when he visited the address the uncle described as a club, a place with a green felt table and a jukebox that played the same 4 songs. He told himself he would stay for an hour, offer a few pointers, and leave with his conscience intact. He stepped into a room where the air had the thickness of old secrets. On a shelf sat a cash counter that blinked red numerals like an accusation. Nearby, a cheap laptop glowed with a crude ledger that tracked bets, losses, and a cushion the men called the Angel, as if benevolence could live in a spreadsheet. The teacher studied the columns and saw the same amateur arrogance he punished in students who thought neat penmanship could replace study. He saw an error that repeated at the same point in the same formula, a rounding choice that shaved pennies the wrong way whenever an entry crossed a threshold. Pennies do what all exiles do when ignored, they gather into a crowd. He felt the old, buried dissertation part of his brain wake and stretch. He had once been the kind of man who could love an error for what it revealed about human laziness. Now he was the kind of man who measured his rent in missed lunches. He corrected the formula for them, and watched as the red stabilized into something like order. The uncle praised him without moving his face. Another envelope appeared. Another after that. He learned to accept praise like a man accepts rain. You do not love it. You merely admit there is weather. He told himself he was building a firewall around the boy's future, and that any money exchanged was a stipend for time spent away from schoolwork. But the city speaks a dialect made of rationalizations. It tells you the road to your ruin is paved with careful words that make you sound responsible while you dig. In this room, amid the cash counter's heartbeat and the ledger's polite lies, the teacher recognized a pattern that lived under all other patterns. When humans fear chaos, they hire someone to whisper that everything can be managed. Whisperers get paid. The teacher did not break the law that night, not in any way that would satisfy a judge. He left with clean hands and a wallet that felt heavier than his conscience. Yet when he lay in bed, the radiator's sermons sounded different. He saw in the ceiling's hairline crack the outline of a number that could be bent, not broken, to create a shadow account in a place no one bothered to look. He did not decide anything. He simply allowed a future to audition. Futures do not need permission. They just need an unguarded door. The first betrayal in this story was not committed against the men at the felt table, or against the city that had already forgiven worse. It was a betrayal of the man he thought he was, the one who believed that discipline and poverty made him honest by default. He understood, with a clarity that made him a little nauseous, that honesty is not the absence of opportunity but the refusal of it. He would have slept better if he had not been as clever as he was. He would have remained safe if safety had not begun to feel like a synonym for small. In the morning, he walked into his classroom with eyes that had learned a new arithmetic. He watched Rocco smirk at a question about compounding interest, and he imagined a ledger absorbing tiny, polite errors like dust. He graded quizzes with the care of a man counting a stranger's medication. He told himself he was only thinking, and thinking was legal everywhere. He told himself he could step away at any time. Then he noticed how easily new habits wear the mask of old virtues. He stayed late to help a student. He stayed later to adjust a spreadsheet for the uncle. He returned home with his shirt still tucked in and his soul quietly unbuttoned. In the space between those small acts, the future made its first down payment on him. By winter he had learned to divide his life into 2 calendars, the school's academic year with its bells and meetings and hollow motivational posters, and the quieter, more dangerous ledger that existed in dim rooms where a television muttered horse races to no one. He carried both calendars inside his head without letting them collide, the way a man can walk 2 dogs who hate each other so long as he keeps the leashes tight. His colleagues noticed only that he seemed less tired, as though he had discovered a vitamin unavailable in pharmacies. They mistook composure for peace. What he had found was not peace but momentum, the sense that he was sliding downhill and could not stop without breaking his own legs. The uncle introduced him to a man named Silvio, whose business card was a handshake and whose office was the back table at a steakhouse where the waiters pretended not to recognize him. Silvio managed a larger operation, numbers that did not fit into notebooks but flowed through wires, accounts, and cash houses disguised as laundromats. He was not interested in tutoring high school boys. He was interested in men who could make columns behave. The teacher listened to Silvio describe the difficulty of controlling chaos when greed disguised itself as loyalty. He recognized the voice of someone who had learned to kill optimism the way other men killed pests, ruthlessly, routinely. Silvio offered him a chance not to be a teacher for a few hours each week but to be something far older, the accountant of fear. He accepted because saying no felt like stepping in front of a train. The money came larger now, in envelopes that felt less like gifts and more like contracts. He stored them not in his freezer but in a metal box under his bed, the kind of box once meant for family photos. He had no photos inside. Only the rust of secrecy. He told himself he would stop after clearing his debts, then after saving enough for a year, then after securing a cushion no school district could cut into with budget freezes. Each time he moved the goalpost like a gambler swearing the next hand would be his last. By spring he no longer feared the mob. He feared boredom. He began noticing small vulnerabilities in the system, not the glaring mistakes he had corrected months earlier but subtler cracks hidden like mold behind wallpaper. Rounding errors, duplicate entries, phantom payouts that no one reconciled because everyone trusted someone else to check. To a man trained in probability, these errors were an invitation. To a man trained in disappointment, they were a door left unlocked. He began building a shadow formula in his mind, one that siphoned cents invisibly into a corner no one swept. Cents became dollars. Dollars became a number large enough to whisper at him while he stood in front of the blackboard teaching teenagers about exponential growth. He imagined exponential growth not as chalk diagrams but as envelopes heavy enough to drag a man into a different life. What made the temptation unbearable was not just the money but the elegance of it. He had spent years teaching bored students that math was beautiful. Now he saw that beauty could be weaponized. He began to live double sentences. To the students he said variance was the spread of possible outcomes. To himself he said variance was the spread of possible fates, and he intended to choose the one that did not end with him grading homework until retirement. His sleep grew restless, his dreams filled with columns of numbers that dissolved into teeth. He woke sweating, then smiled because even his nightmares seemed to confirm he was onto something immense. He started rehearsing lies the way actors rehearse monologues. If anyone asked about late nights, he would say grading. If anyone asked about envelopes, he would say private tutoring. Lies taste bitter the first time you chew them, then they turn into gum you can carry all day. He began chewing constantly. One night he stayed in the back office after Silvio and the others left. The ledger remained open on the cheap laptop. He copied certain figures into a small notebook he carried in his jacket. His hands did not shake. He told himself he was only testing a hypothesis, the way a scientist tests whether fire burns before setting the house ablaze. But he knew. He knew the difference between curiosity and intention. He had already crossed the border. In school, Rocco had improved marginally, enough to suggest effort but not enough to betray genius. The teacher watched him joke with classmates, watched him strut down hallways wearing sneakers worth more than his paycheck, and wondered whether the boy understood how fragile all of it was. He doubted it. Youth confuses invincibility with destiny. That confusion breeds men like Silvio, men who believe control is permanent until one day it is not. The teacher did not want to become Silvio. He wanted to become invisible. The brilliance of his plan was that no one would ever notice the theft until long after he was gone. He constructed it the way an engineer constructs a bridge, careful to account for weight and weather. He planned to siphon gradually, never so much that alarms rang, never so little that he died poor. 3 million was the number he chose because it felt like both salvation and symmetry. Enough to start a new life, not enough to bankrupt an empire. He studied train schedules, border crossings, bank jurisdictions. He read about countries without extradition treaties as if researching vacation spots. Each fact he gathered became another brick in the wall between him and the man he pretended to be at school. By June he no longer corrected students for daydreaming. He had become a daydream himself. He moved through the halls like a ghost rehearsing his own disappearance. His colleagues thought he was distracted by divorce or midlife fatigue. They had no idea he was pregnant with a future that would kill the version of himself they thought they knew. The plan was almost ready. The summer would provide the quiet he needed to finish it. The boy, the uncle, Silvio, even the school, all of them were scaffolding. He no longer wanted to save Rocco. He wanted to save himself. And salvation, he understood now, was indistinguishable from theft. Summer in New York blurs the line between survival and surrender. The air clings to the skin, subways stink of metal sweat, and every sound feels amplified by heat that has no patience for secrets. He thrived in that suffocation, because secrecy was all he carried. With school out, he lived untethered, no bells to mask his movements, no students to interrupt the blueprint of escape tightening inside his skull. He spent days visiting libraries under false pretense, slipping into corners with maps of airports, books about finance, guides about living abroad. He chose titles carefully so no librarian would notice patterns: travel memoirs, academic treatises, fiction about exile. Behind each mask was a man cataloging the science of disappearance. He picked 3 countries as possible destinations, each chosen not for beauty but for bureaucracy. One had weak banking oversight. Another had police paid better by bribes than salaries. The third was chosen simply because Americans rarely visited and any face from New York would be a blur in its dust. His plan hinged on invisibility, not glamour. He knew men like Silvio believed safety came from building fortresses, surrounding themselves with muscle and favors. He believed the opposite. The safest fortress is the one no one bothers to storm. But before he could vanish, there was the matter of stealing without being seen. He returned to the steakhouse office under excuses of balancing books. The back table reeked of cigars ground out in half-eaten steaks. Silvio trusted him now, trusted him the way a man trusts his own shadow, always there, never questioned. Trust is a currency more valuable than envelopes. He spent hours studying their ledgers. He discovered that the organization operated on arrogance, too many small operators feeding into too many intermediaries, each assuming someone above them checked the totals. In reality, no one did. It was a system begging to be skimmed. He built the siphon not with violence but with decimals. A fraction of a percent carved from payouts, rerouted through ghost entries, bundled under invented names of bettors who would never exist. He made sure losses balanced wins, so no ghost grew suspiciously lucky. Every false line looked like an accident, the kind that only mattered when stacked together in numbers large enough to be obscene. The brilliance was that it worked quietly. Each week the cash counter blinked red, the laptop hummed, and no one noticed the invisible tributary feeding into an account he had opened years earlier under a dead professor's name. At first the sums were modest, enough to cover his debts, enough to buy new suits without looking indulgent. But numbers compound like guilt. Within months, the account fattened into something grotesque. He watched balances grow late at night in his dark apartment, the glow of the screen painting him in the same pale light addicts swear when their bodies beg for more. He told himself he was almost done, that 3 million was the ceiling, the number that would free him. Yet he could feel his discipline thinning, stretched like a rubber band on the edge of breaking. Around this time, Rocco stumbled. The boy had been coasting, but summer eroded his effort. He began skipping sessions, blowing cash in places his uncle's men disapproved of, leaving trails of recklessness. The teacher noticed bruises once on Rocco's arm, the kind shaped not by fights but by warnings. He realized the boy was not protected by family ties but imprisoned by them. That night, lying awake, he wondered if part of his crime was not theft but betrayal of a boy who had looked at him with faint, unspoken hope. He silenced that thought quickly. Sentiment was a leash. He convinced himself Rocco was collateral, that no man escapes without dragging shadows behind him. Meanwhile Silvio grew more relaxed, mistaking calm for loyalty. He even joked one night that maybe the teacher should quit the school, join full-time, live well instead of scraping. The teacher laughed politely while inside his pulse screamed. He knew that invitations like that were not suggestions but traps. Decline too sharply and you become suspicious. Accept, and you become owned. He maintained the smile, but the decision crystallized. He had to vanish soon. 3 million was nearly assembled. All that remained was timing. Timing is the hinge of every con, every escape, every betrayal. He chose late August, when the city stank of rot, when school prepared to restart, when the mob's attention dulled in the haze of heat and drunken baseball games. He rehearsed it in his mind, money transferred, ticket purchased under an alias, exit so clean it would feel like erasure. Yet erasure never comes without residue. He underestimated residue in the form of a janitor at the steakhouse who noticed the teacher's notebook once, open for a second too long. He underestimated residue in the form of Silvio's paranoia, which slept lightly even when disguised as trust. Most dangerously, he underestimated himself. Because beneath all his discipline, beneath the spreadsheets and the planning, lived a streak of arrogance, the kind that whispers you are smarter than fate itself. He went to bed one night staring at the ceiling crack that resembled a branching river, imagining all the tributaries of cash feeding into his escape. He smiled. He believed the hardest part was over. He did not know the hardest part had not yet begun. The night he decided to move the money for the final time, the city hummed with a storm that never arrived. Heat lightning flashed over rooftops, silent and mocking, like someone flipping a switch in heaven. He sat in his apartment, blinds drawn, laptop glowing, fingers tapping passwords with the steadiness of a surgeon. The account balance pulsed on the screen, $2,987,460. Close enough to his chosen number, close enough to freedom. He told himself the final transfer would be like cutting an umbilical cord. Once it was done, he would belong to no one. He executed the transaction in increments, small bites that slipped through the banking system unnoticed, cloaked by the noise of 1,000 other daily transfers. He had rehearsed this a dozen times, always backing out at the last second, but tonight he finished it. The screen confirmed. $3 million sat under his control, invisible, his salvation wrapped in numbers. And for the first time, he felt not relief but terror. It was a terror born from clarity. The theft was no longer hypothetical, no longer practice. It was real. He had crossed the line and burned the bridge. Somewhere, though not tonight, someone would notice. Somewhere, men with hands like unwise decisions would frown at a column that didn't balance. Somewhere, Silvio's smile would shift, and the city would close in. He packed quickly. Clothes, passport, the metal box emptied at last. He moved through his apartment like a burglar in his own life, taking only what could not betray him. At dawn, he stepped onto the street. New York smelled of hot asphalt and old promises. He carried a cheap duffel bag and a mind rehearsing lies for anyone who asked. The first leg of the plan was simple: a bus to Philadelphia, a train to Miami, then a flight out under a borrowed name. He kept his eyes low, his pace steady, as though invisibility were a posture. But paranoia has sharp teeth. On the bus he caught a man watching him too long, though maybe it was only coincidence. In the train station, he thought he heard his name whispered, though no one turned. He began sweating not from heat but from the weight of awareness that he was no longer a teacher, no longer even a thief, but prey. In Miami, the airport gleamed like a cathedral to departures. He walked through it rehearsing calm, but his pulse was chaos. At the counter, the attendant asked for his passport. For a moment his throat locked. He imagined Silvio standing behind him, a hand on his shoulder, a quiet laugh in his ear. But the attendant only smiled, stamped, waved him through. Relief came in stabs. He moved toward the gate, each step a promise that the old life was already crumbling behind him. Yet shadows travel faster than flights. Back in New York, Silvio's men had already begun tracing numbers. A junior accountant noticed the missing trail, reported it, and set off a chain of suspicion. By the time the teacher settled into his seat on the plane, Silvio knew something was wrong. The uncle knew. And Rocco overheard enough to realize the man who had once been his tutor had stolen not just money but the fragile leash that held his family's chaos together. The teacher believed he was escaping into anonymity. In reality, he was stepping into the most visible chapter of his life. He thought he had 3 million reasons to believe he had beaten the mob. The mob only needed one reason to prove him wrong. As the plane engines roared, he pressed his forehead to the window. The city shrank beneath him, lights fading like dying embers. He allowed himself a smile, small and private. He thought he had won. What he didn't know was that disappearances are not clean breaks. They are negotiations with fate, and fate always demands a second meeting. The first weeks abroad tasted like stolen fruit. Sweet, intoxicating, but with a bitterness that lingered after every bite. He landed in a country where the sea pressed against the city like an uninvited guest, where humidity warped wood and memory alike. He rented a small apartment under an alias that felt flimsy in his mouth, a name borrowed from a passport that had passed through too many hands. The building smelled of fried oil and mildew, the kind of place where neighbors minded their own business because they had learned long ago that curiosity shortens life expectancy. He filled the days with rituals of survival, cash exchanged in dim offices, long walks through markets where strangers sold counterfeit perfume, nights spent staring at ceiling fans that trembled like nervous hands. He told himself he was free, yet every sound outside his door tightened his chest. He checked locks 3 times. He kept the duffel bag by his bed, packed, as though escape had become not a plan but a permanent posture. The money sat in offshore accounts, numbers that shimmered on a laptop screen. He never touched it directly, only moved it in circles, layering transactions until it blurred into legality. $3 million had never felt so heavy. The weight was not in the bills, he rarely saw cash, but in the knowledge that men were searching for him, men who would never forgive, men who considered forgiveness an insult to arithmetic. Back in New York, Silvio had not exploded in rage the way underlings expected. He grew quiet, which was worse. He studied ledgers with a stare that melted loyalty into fear. The uncle tightened the leash on Rocco, demanding names, habits, any detail about the teacher that could become a thread. Rocco, in his clumsy bravado, mentioned late-night sessions, the teacher's obsession with numbers, the quiet way he seemed to practice disappearing even when he stood in front of a class. It was enough. Enough for Silvio to realize the theft was not just financial but personal, a betrayal of trust dressed in chalk dust. They began to search, not with official channels but with whispers, with envelopes slipped across bars, with photographs circulated among men who remembered faces better than birthdays. In exile, the teacher sensed the net tightening even without seeing it. He avoided routines, changed routes, let his beard grow. Yet paranoia is not the same as safety. He started drinking more, cheap rum that numbed his edges. Nights grew longer, dreams filled with voices speaking English in a land that spoke none. Sometimes he thought he saw familiar eyes in crowds, sometimes he heard footsteps too steady behind him. Each time he survived, he congratulated his discipline. Each time he reminded himself he was smarter than fate. That arrogance, the same that had birthed the theft, whispered again. Perhaps he could build a life here, perhaps even fall in love, perhaps the mob's memory was shorter than legend claimed. He almost believed it. Until the letter arrived. Slipped under his door, no stamp, no address. Just one sheet of paper. On it, a simple equation written in his own handwriting, copied from a lesson he had once given Rocco. Variance equals the average of squared deviations. Nothing else. No signature, no threat. Just proof that someone had found him, someone who knew exactly who he was. He stared at it until his eyes blurred, the ceiling fan stuttering above him. $3 million in the bank meant nothing now. The numbers had become a countdown. He folded the paper carefully, placed it inside the duffel bag, and sat in the dark until morning. For the first time since leaving New York, he understood, he had not disappeared. He had only been granted a head start. He stopped sleeping after the letter. Nights became long vigils, listening to the city breathe outside his window, every horn and shout a possible signal, every shadow on the wall a silhouette rehearsing violence. He drank to quiet his nerves, but the alcohol only amplified paranoia, twisting small sounds into verdicts. He carried the duffel everywhere now, no longer treating it as luggage but as an organ he could not survive without. Freedom, he realized, was heavier than chains. He tried to trace the letter. Asked the building manager, who shrugged. Asked neighbors, who shrugged harder. In this city, people lived by the rule of blind eyes. He began checking the hallway at odd hours, hoping to catch whoever had slipped the paper under his door. He never did. The silence became its own form of torture. And then came the second message. This time not a letter but a voice. He returned to the apartment one evening to find his radio playing, though he had left it unplugged. A voice, smooth and calm, recited numbers, odds, spreads, phrases familiar from the ledger back in New York. It played for exactly 2 minutes before the static swallowed it. He stood frozen, duffel in hand, pulse like broken glass. The message was clear. They could touch him any time they wished. They were not here to kill him quickly. They wanted erosion. They wanted him to dissolve under the weight of his own fear. Meanwhile, in New York, Rocco's life unraveled. The boy had thought himself untouchable as long as the teacher carried the burden of tutoring. But once the theft became legend, once whispers spread that a schoolteacher had humiliated the family, Rocco's name turned from asset to liability. He was beaten once in a back alley, warned that loyalty is inherited but betrayal contaminates the bloodline. He thought often of the teacher, resentful, admiring, terrified. Somewhere deep down, he wondered if the theft was not just money but a gift, proof that escape was possible. Silvio, however, saw none of it as romantic. For him, it was mathematics. 3 million stolen equaled 3 million reasons to make an example. Yet months passed with no sight of the teacher. Dead ends multiplied. Informants contradicted one another. Airports had no records, banks denied leaks. Silvio's rage grew quiet again, and men who served him grew afraid of that quiet. In exile, the teacher decided running was no longer enough. He had to erase himself completely. He visited forgers, bought papers so crude he could barely look at them without laughing. He learned the black markets of passports, watched as desperate men sold their identities like used shoes. He memorized the mannerisms of locals, altered his gait, tried on accents in front of mirrors. He thought he could melt into the city the way sugar disappears in coffee. But fear is insoluble. One night, as he crossed a narrow street, he saw a car idling with its lights off. Inside, a shape waited, motionless, too still to be coincidence. He ducked into a shop, waited, emerged 10 minutes later. The car was gone. He told himself it meant nothing. Yet the next day, another letter appeared, slipped under the door while he was awake inside. This one carried only 4 words. "We'll see you soon." No threats, no details. Just inevitability. He sat on the bed, staring at those words until dawn. He realized then that disappearance was not freedom. It was a stage. And the audience, somewhere out there, was waiting for the final act. The final act began not with violence but with quiet. He woke one morning to find the hallway silent, the usual coughs and arguments of neighbors absent. Even the city outside seemed to hold its breath. He knew the rhythm of streets, and this stillness was unnatural, like the pause before a gunshot. He packed the duffel automatically, hands moving faster than thought, stuffing money, clothes, papers into its gut. The second lock on the door stuck for a moment, and in that pause he heard it. Footsteps, slow and unhurried, coming up the stairwell. Whoever it was, they were not rushing. They were arriving. He bolted down the fire escape, the metal rattling beneath his shoes. The alley smelled of rotting fruit, and for a heartbeat he thought he had escaped. Then he saw the car, same shape as before, idling at the mouth of the street. He froze. A door opened. A man stepped out, not Silvio, not the uncle, but someone younger, cleaner, with eyes that carried no anger, only duty. The teacher realized then that the mob's vengeance was not fueled by rage but by arithmetic. He had stolen 3 million. The equation demanded balance. He turned and ran, duffel slamming against his hip, lungs tearing open. Streets blurred. Markets flashed by. He could hear the engine behind him, patient, rolling. He ducked into a church, the kind where plaster saints frown down at sinners. He pressed his back against the cold wall, clutching the duffel like a child clutches a parent. For the first time since the theft, he prayed, not for salvation but for invisibility. He left through a side door, vanished into alleys, moving with the desperation of prey that knows it cannot outrun the predator forever. Days passed like fever. He no longer stayed in one apartment but drifted between cheap hotels, always paying cash, always sleeping with one eye open. The duffel grew heavier, not from weight but from what it symbolized. $3 million was no longer money. It was a curse, a beacon calling hunters closer. He began to consider abandoning it, burying it, burning it. Yet each time he tried, his hands betrayed him, clutching tighter. The money had become him, and he had become the money. Back in New York, the story spread like smoke. A teacher had robbed the mob and vanished. Some claimed he was living on a beach, others swore his body was already in concrete. Rocco, caught between myth and reality, wondered if the teacher's fate was a warning or an invitation. Silvio said nothing. Silence, in his world, was the same as a verdict. And then, as suddenly as the teacher had appeared in exile, he disappeared again. One night, his hotel room was found empty, bed untouched, duffel gone. No witnesses. No blood. Just absence. Some say he boarded a boat under another name, vanished into the folds of the world where even money loses meaning. Others whisper that the mob finally caught him, and that his grave is unmarked, deep beneath foundations poured with cement. But the truth lives in shadows, where facts bend. The only certainty is that he was never seen again. The legend of the teacher grew teeth, retold in bars, classrooms, police precincts. A man who stole 3 million from the mob and vanished, a ghost, a warning, a fantasy. And maybe, just maybe, a man who outsmarted death itself. If you've followed this story until the end, remember this: disappearances are rarely clean, and freedom always leaves a scar. Put a like if the story gripped you, and don't forget to subscribe, because some ghosts still have more to tell.